Sicilian Defense.
e4, c5.
One of the most popular modern openings leading to a sharp substantial struggle. Quite a number of books have been written about the Sicilian defense, but to this very day chess theoreticians do not concur on many complicated variations. The Sicilian defense is employed by almost all the world's leading players. White usually develops initiative on the K side, and black does the same on the Q side. 1. Closed system.
Knight c3.
White abstains from an advance in the center by d2-d4, striving to build up a pawn attack on the K side. Black's plans include occupation of the central d4 square and developing the initiative on the Q side.
Knight c6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, d3, d6, bishop e3, e6.
Here,
Knight g e2.
with the subsequent 8, Mentary d2 was usually played, but now preference is given to 7, f4, since this makes it possible to move the knight to f3, a much more active position than one on e2.
f4, knight g e7, knight f3, short castle, knight d4.
White gets ready to launch an attack on the K side, while black, after benteng b8, will move b5 with counterplay on the Q side.
e4, c5.
2. Scheveningen Variation. This system owes its name to the Dutch city of Scheveningen, where it was first employed at an international tournament in 1923.
Knight f3, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop e2.
This bishop development is characteristic of the Scheveningen variation. Subsequently, the bishop may be transferred to d3 if white starts to attack black's K side, or to f3 if white limits himself to exerting pressure in the center.
Knight c6, bishop e3, bishop e7, short castle, f4, bishop d7.
Without losing time on the moves like a6 or Mentary c7, black strives to transfer the bishop to c6 to attack white's central pawn.
Queen e1, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop c6, queen g3, g6, e4, c5.
3. Rauscher Variation. The system is one of the sharpest and most involved continuations of the Sicilian defense. It was developed by the noted Soviet theoretician Vsevolod Rauscher. After having castled long, white combines pressure along the d file with an attack on the K side.
Knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop g5, e6, queen d2.
In reply to
h6,
white moves,
bishop takes f6,
and black is compelled to play, since
queen takes f6,
is bad because of
knight d b5, queen d8, long castle,
without any chances for black to defend the d6 pawn.
g takes f6,
Another continuation here is
a6, long castle, bishop d7,
in this case black also frequently castles long.
bishop e7, long castle, short castle, e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3,
4. Dragon variation.
g6, bishop e3, knight g4,
Is erroneous because of
bishop b5, check, bishop d7, queen takes g4, bishop g7,
currently the next move is employed more often.
f3, bishop e2,
This is the so-called classic continuation of the dragon.
short castle, knight c6,
In reply to
f4,
black will play,
queen b6,
pinning the d4 knight, attacking the b2 pawn and threatening coup de pukul e4.
knight b3, bishop e6, f4,
The main position of this variation, named so because the pattern of black pawns d6, e7, f7, g6 and h7 resembles a lizard, i.e., dragon. Boleslavsky, Boke, International Tournament Stockholm, 1948.
e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, e6, bishop e2, a6.
As noted above, nowadays black tries to get along without this in the next moves.
Short castle, queen c7, f4, knight c6, bishop e3, bishop e7, queen e1, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, e5.
This counterblow in the center proves premature and leads to a poor position. Black should have castled and then transferred the c8 bishop to c6 via d7.
F takes e5, d takes e5, queen g3.
With this move white attacks two pawns. Black avoids the material loss but his position is unsatisfactory.
Bishop c5, bishop takes c5, queen takes c5, check, king h1. Short castle,
Cannot be played due to
rook takes f6, king f8.
Of course, it is unpleasant for black to lose the chance to castle but otherwise he cannot protect the g7 pawn.
Knight d5.
White has to play energetically to take advantage of the black king's deplorable situation. If
Knight takes d5.
Then
Queen takes e5.
And at the best black remains a pawn down in a worse position.
Knight takes e4. Queen takes e5. knight f2, check. Rook takes f2. Queen takes f2. Queen e7, check.
Leads to mate.
Knight f6. Rook a d1.
In the case of
Knight takes d5.
wins.
Bishop h5.
If
Knight g4.
then
Bishop takes g4. Bishop takes g4. Rook takes f7, check. King takes f7. Rook f1, check.
and white wins.
Bishop e6. b4.
If
Queen takes c2.
then the smothered mate follows in 5 moves.
Queen d6, check. King g8. Knight e7, check. King f8. Knight g6, check. King g8. Queen f8, check. Rook takes f8. Knight e7, mate. Queen c6. Knight takes f6. G takes f6. Rook takes f6. Rook g8. Bishop f3.
But even after
Queen c4. Rook f4. Queen takes a2. Bishop d5. Bishop takes d5. Queen d6, check. King e8. Rook takes d5.
black should resign.
Queen b6.
This leads to the loss of a piece.
Rook d6. Queen f2. Bishop takes b7. Queen takes c2. Rook d takes e6.
Black resigned. Spassky, Petrosian, World Championship, 1969.
e4. c5. Knight f3. d6. d4. c takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight f6. Knight c3. a6.
This is also one of the sharpest variations in the Sicilian defense.
Bishop g5.
The usual continuation here is
e6. Knight b d7. Bishop c4.
in the case of
e6.
black must reckon with possibility of the bishop sacrifice.
Bishop takes e6. Queen a5. Queen d2.
Previously the next move was played there.
e6. h6.
Black wants to determine the white bishop's position.
Bishop takes f6.
White has no intention of losing time on the bishop's retreat and counts on developing his pieces quicker than his opponent.
Knight takes f6. Long castle. e6. Rook H E1.
Deserving attention is
Bishop D7.
followed by castling long. Since the white king is also on the Q side, it is not simple at all for white to develop an offensive in this sector.
Bishop E7.
Black prepares to castle kingside, but the king's position there would be dangerous.
F4. Short castle. Bishop D3.
White fortifies his king's position before going over to the offensive. Meanwhile, black tries to prop up the E6 point.
Rook E8. King B1. Bishop F8. G4.
White sacrifices a pawn in order to open up a file against black's king. Since the pawn threatens to advance, black decides to accept the sacrifice.
Knight takes G4. Queen G2. Knight F6. Rook G1. Bishop D7. F5. E5.
Is somewhat better.
King H8.
Black does not take any steps against further opening up of the lines.
Rook D F1. Queen D8.
Black makes haste to bring up the queen for defense, but this proves to be insufficient.
F takes E6. F takes E6. E5.
The start of a beautiful final combination.
D takes E5. Knight E4.
Clearly,
Knight takes E4.
cannot be played because of
Rook takes F8. Check. Rook takes F8. Queen takes G7. Mate.
after.
E takes D4. Knight takes F6.
Black has no defense against 24. Mentary G6.
Knight H5. Queen G6.
White wins also after.
Knight F4. Rook takes F4. E takes F4. Knight D6. F3. Queen H7. Mate. Knight F3. Queen B6. Rook G5.
With the irresistible threat of 27. Coup to F6.
E takes D4.
This loses immediately.
Knight G5.
Black resigned.
Knight F6. Rook takes F6. G takes F6. Knight F7. Mate.
Alovich, Gufeld, USSR, 1967.
E4. C5. Knight F3. D6. D4. C takes D4. Knight takes D4. Knight F6. Knight C3. G6. Bishop E3. Bishop G7. F3.
The Rouser attack in the Dragon Variation. This continuation with castling in opposite directions leads to very sharp play.
Short castle. Queen D2. Knight C6. Bishop C4.
An important move. White prevents the D6-D5 advance in the center.
Bishop D7.
The usual continuation here is,
long castle,
but white wants to attack the K side without wasting time.
h4, queen a5, bishop b3, rook f c8.
Black played all this following the latest advances in theory. He vacated the f8 square for the king and sought counterplay on the c file.
h5,
White sacrifices a pawn to bolster the attack. Black accepts the sacrifice since he cannot in any case forestall the opening of the h file.
knight takes h5, g4.
After.
Knight f6.
The whole battle is still ahead. White would have to castle long to draw up reserves for the attack.
Knight takes d4.
Black exchanges two minor pieces in order to transfer his knight from h5 to a stronger position. In doing so he fails to take into account the fact that his king remains defenseless.
Bishop takes d4. Bishop takes d4. Queen takes d4. Knight f4. Bishop takes f7. Check.
Evidently Black did not take this sacrifice into account in his preliminary calculations.
King takes f7. Rook takes h7. Check. King e6. Queen g7. Rook e8. Queen f7. Check.
Now the Black king is forced to start on the way to the middle of the board, where inevitable doom awaits for it.
King e5. Long castle.
White winds up the development simultaneously creating new threats.
Rook a c8. Knight d5.
Black has no satisfactory defense. After.
Knight e6. f4. Check. King takes e4. Queen takes g6. Check. King f3. Queen d3. Check.
He is mated within several moves.
Rook takes c2. Check.
After.
King takes c2. Queen a4. Check.
Black could count on salvation since the white king would not have a satisfactory retreat. For instance,
King c1. Rook c8. Check. Knight c3. Knight e2. Check. King d2. Queen d4. Check.
and white is compelled to agree to repetition by. In the case of
King takes e2.
there follows
Bishop b5. Check. Knight takes b5. Rook c2. Check. King e1. Queen g1. Check. King d2. King b1. Rook takes b2. Check.
is futile since after
King takes b2. Queen b5. Check. King a1.
black has no continuation of the attack.
Knight d3. Queen g7. Check.
Black resigned.
King e6. Queen takes e7. Check. Rook takes e7. Rook takes e7. Mate.